Freaks, the most disturbing film ever made. Upon its release in the year 1932, the audience couldn't last more than 15 minutes before running away from the theater in fright. It is said that pregnant women miscarried their fetuses amid the terror, and people were shocked to such a degree that they refused to recount what they had witnessed, which forced director Tod Browning to cut a significant portion of the film. And despite that, Freaks was banned worldwide for 50 years. In the 80s, an English company bought a copy of the film, and after watching it, they were appalled by the unprecedented violence, and a further 30 minutes had to be cut. The story revolves around a group of horribly disfigured characters working at a circus. We see them commit some unspeakable, disgusting crimes as a form of retaliation. It is so vile that it makes modern horror films look like a joke in comparison. And some even speculate that real actors were actually murdered during the making of the film. And how can that be untrue when considering the modesty of the makeup and special effects at the time? Everything about this film is shrouded in mystery, which still puzzles the world to this day. This is not my review. I was just reading a post I found somewhere on Facebook. And as someone who has seen the film before making any comments, I can assure you that these kinds of clickbaity posts are extremely exaggerated, if not completely wrong, and they undoubtedly misrepresent the film. In order to elaborate, I have to get into spoilers, so if you haven't watched Freaks yet, maybe you should come back later. To put everything in perspective, I will start by clarifying what exactly is Freaks. Is it the most disturbing film ever made? Is it a vile, unpresentable work? None of those definitions even come close to describing Freaks. I can't even categorize it as a horror film. Sure, it has some horror elements, but it is first and foremost a drama adapted from a short story titled Spurs by the American author Tod Robbins. The story follows a group of disabled circus performers. One of them, named Hans, falls in love with a trapeze artist who ostensibly loves him back, but in secret, she starts a relationship with another circus performer known by the name of Hercules. And together, they scheme against Hans to exploit him financially before disposing of him. That's the main plot that pushes the events forward. Between these events, the film spends a relatively long time just documenting the daily lives of the disabled characters, focusing on their relationships, how they adapt to their conditions, and the discrimination and mockery they face from the quote-unquote normal people. And this is my favorite aspect of the film. I was not expecting such a compassionate and understanding depiction of people with disabilities. Of course, when taking into account the time period during which the film was made and the reputation that tainted its legacy for decades. When I started the film, I was ready to see a bunch of leprechauns viciously murdering other people. But what I actually saw were just Angelino, Half-Boy, the Living Torso, the Siamese Twins, and the three Pinheads among other cool characters with quirky names. The film presented those characters the way they are. It didn't try to hide their dissimilarities or try to convince us that they look normal. On the other hand, the film didn't make their differences a requirement for empathizing with them. Their disabilities are parts of their characters for sure, and I think to deny that is to indulge in pretense. But they shouldn't be defined by these disabilities alone. Each one of them has their own principles, habits, quirks, and loved ones. Tod Browning made the film with this aspect in mind. There are no scenes that are designed for the sole purpose of showing someone's disability or the way they adapt to it. In almost every scene, there is an attempt to flesh out these characters and approach them from different angles. For instance, when we see the Siamese twins argue about their heading, we form an idea of Violet's hot-headedness and Daisy's compliancy. Or when we see this girl holding a glass with her foot, we get her viewpoint on Cleopatra and the motives behind her relationship with Hans. It's worth mentioning that the film avoided showing any circus acts with these characters just to hammer home the message that these are human beings, not exhibition pieces. The only characters we see doing circus acts are Cleopatra and Hercules. It's almost like the film is pointing at them, saying, "These are the freaks whom we should gaze at with fascination." That's not what I meant, Hans. Your fiancé is right there, you know.
Oh, freedom, my dear. I have eyes for only one woman. The woman I asked to be my wife.
Yeah, right. Now that we have a notion of the film's true nature and intention, it is time to ask, how did that infamy arise, and why did it stick like glue all those years? It is not a violent film, aside from one scene which I will get to later, and yet, even to this day, it's listed as one of the most disturbing films ever made. To unravel this mystery, let's go back to 1932. Let's try to put things into perspective to better understand the audience's extreme reaction back then. The film's test screenings were disastrous. Reports referred to cases of people vomiting, fainting, and running out of the theater. One pregnant woman tried to sue MGM, claiming that the film forced her to miscarry. Coeval critics bashed the film with some melodious statements like, "It is obviously an unhealthy and generally disagreeable work. It took a weak mind to produce it, and it takes a strong stomach to look at it. Anyone who considers this entertainment should be placed in a pathological ward in some hospital." There were critics who reacted to the film positively, or at least humanely, but those were the minority. The overwhelming negativity led the higher-ups at MGM to remove around 30 minutes of the film's runtime, which included a different prologue, more comedic scenes, and supposedly some gruesome details during the ending sequence. But the issues people took with Freaks were too deep to resolve by sieving the film. Therefore, even the remaining 64 minutes were not spared, and the film was banned in the UK and several states in the US, causing a huge financial loss for the company and costing the director his reputation and his career. One might theorize that audiences in 1932 were not used to horror or murder being depicted on screen, hence their overreaction. But that's not true. There were plenty of horror and crime films that preceded Freaks. Films that depicted twisted ideas, murders, weird creatures, and disfigured characters, many of which were massively successful. Let's take a look at The Phantom of the Opera, for instance. A film released in 1925 about a disfigured composer who falls for a beautiful singer and tries to push her away from her lover so he can have her for himself. Another example is Frankenstein, released in 1931, about a mad scientist obsessed with the concept of creating life. Eventually, he assembles a living creature from dead body parts. Both of these films did pretty well with critics and audiences. Despite that, from my perspective, they are far darker and more twisted than Freaks, conceptually and visually. The second half of The Phantom of the Opera is basically just this weird-looking man trying to force himself on the lady he loves. And to accomplish that, he threatens, kidnaps, and kills different characters. In Frankenstein, the scientist turns to grave digging and body snatching to assemble his creation. And throughout the film, we see a hanged body, a man being strangled, and a drowned child. Freaks is much calmer and tamer than those films. As I said earlier, the only violent part is the ending, and within the context of the film, the violence was merited, because these two are some of the most despicable characters of all time. Cleopatra exploited Hans' feelings for her own gain. She intended to let him die an excruciatingly slow death by the poison she slipped into his drinks and medications, as a means to seize his inherited fortune and run away with Hercules, who does not abstain from murdering anyone who might expose them. This leaves no doubt in my mind that audiences in 1932 were in fact accustomed to the visual portrayal of murder and even mutilation. But if that were the case, then what sparked the public outrage against Freaks? Well, there were two major contributing factors. The first one is casting actors with real congenital conditions. The original plan was to cast Lon Chaney in the leading role, the star of the aforementioned Phantom of the Opera and a frequent collaborator with director Tod Browning. Chaney passed away in 1930, leading the director to consider a more authentic approach. Tod Browning was always fascinated with carnivals and sideshows. He joined the circus when he was only 16 years old and became acquainted with many sideshow performers, some of whom had disabilities. Thus, Browning convinced the studio to discard makeup and costumes and instead hire real-life sideshow performers with real disabilities and present them as they are. Evidently, critics and the audience were perfectly fine watching actors with prosthetics and flammable chemicals glued to their faces, but couldn't handle watching real people who merely looked different. The second factor, and perhaps the more impactful one, is that Freaks treats these characters like human beings, entitles them to win the conflict, and asks the audience to empathize with them. And the audience's response to that was essentially the same as Cleopatra's when she was welcomed to join the Little Freaks family. In films like Frankenstein, The Phantom of the Opera, and others, although there were attempts at humanizing the odd creature or the deformed character, the conclusion is usually reduced to the monster is violating beauty, or let's burn this abomination at the stake. Freaks dared to flip this formula on its head by turning the beauty into a malicious beast. But apparently, the mere concept of rooting for a disabled character against an able-bodied one made fetuses break out of their mother's wombs. Now, I can't say for certain how I would feel about the film if I were alive in 1932. I don't have the mentality of an audience member from back then, so I can only speak from the perspective of a modern audience member. And as such, I have to say, critics and audiences, may their souls rest in peace, were simply being intolerant assholes. Accepting and respecting a disabled person requires nothing but reasonable accommodations. If they can accommodate their needs, then everyone else can accommodate their tolerance at the very least. This was one moral demand that the majority wouldn't even consider, let alone accept. But that was more than 90 years ago. How different are things now? If we observe society's attitudes towards persons with disabilities through history, we can trace a slow progression, notwithstanding that such progression has less to do with improved modern moral conscience and more to do with the atrocities committed by our ancestors. The way disabled people were treated in the past is utterly disgraceful. For centuries, disabled people were believed to be possessed by evil spirits or punished by the devil for their sins. With the development of medical and social fields, new measures were being established to care for and accommodate them. But that didn't put an end to the unfairness and discrimination they had to endure, if not directly by ableists, then indirectly by the dominant social hierarchy, which eliminated their opportunities for education or employment. And as a result, they ended up homeless and beggars on the streets. In the last few decades, awareness has been spreading among the public, and attitudes towards disabilities have become more rational, albeit contrived, which can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the situation.
A lot of times I see kids staring at me. That's okay with me.
I welcome it. Kids are curious.
But what I struggle with is when a parent shushes them or quickly pulls them in the other direction.
When a child is hustled away from a person or hushed, it stigmatizes even just asking the question.
Because kids then associate disability with feeling ashamed.
Some developed countries have enacted laws protecting people with disabilities and securing fair opportunities for them. This social and moral shift began to permeate art. Thus, we started seeing bigger inclusion and better representation of disability on screen. And we started seeing more disabled characters actually portrayed by disabled actors, as they should. I'm not inherently against able-bodied actors portraying disabled characters, a process also known as cribbing up. But I do dislike it, and I applaud filmmakers, showrunners, and casting directors who commit to seeking disabled actors for these roles. Firstly, because disabled actors don't get many opportunities to play other types of characters. I know many people don't want to believe that, but this is the reality. Their chances are pretty much limited to disabled characters or fantasy creatures who match their physique. Wouldn't you agree, Peter Dinklage? And secondly, these actors can add to their roles layers of authenticity and rawness that are nearly impossible to replicate with able-bodied actors. Sorry for getting sidetracked of the main subject, but I wanted to shed light on the current state of disability inclusion both in society and art before going over the modern perception of the film. Freaks is now categorized as a cult classic among other films that failed upon release but found their audience over the years. Freaks assumed this title when it was rediscovered in the early 1960s, especially following its screening at the Venice Film Festival and its premiere in the United Kingdom. Its legacy grew even more during the 70s and 80s as it was regularly screened across the US while finding its way to the small screen. In 1994, Freaks was included in the United States National Film Registry, which preserves intellectually and creatively significant films. Many acclaimed filmmakers expressed their fondness for the film. Among them are Tim Burton and Guillermo del Toro, who called it a singularity and said there has never been and will never be a film like this again. So, Freaks is no longer the vile, ostracized piece of media it was once labeled as, and the esteem it has gained since its re-emergence is undeniable. But the notoriety didn't completely wear off. It remains to be identified as one of the most disturbing films ever made by numerous media platforms, some of which blatantly state casting people with real physical deformities as a reason for their categorization. Such takes aren't particularly shocking when factoring in the decades of misrepresentation or lack thereof, which have conditioned a large portion of the public to an outdated, narrow viewpoint of the disabled community. As someone outside of this community, I did my best to shed some light on the issue, and hopefully I didn't come off as completely ignorant. But I don't think I'm entitled to pass a judgment regarding the current state of disability representation. I think only members of the community have the right to do so. However, I can judge the filmmaking aspects of Freaks, starting with the plot. I already commended the film's originality and fearlessness in subverting the Beauty and the Beast formula, along with the maturity with which the characters were presented. The casting was outstanding, all of them perfectly fit their parts and all of them did pretty well. And my praise isn't limited to the disabled actors. Olga Baclanova and Henry Victor were great as Cleopatra and Hercules, the main villains of the story, whose physical superiority and malicious motives sharply contrasted with the protagonist's limitations and sincerity, which made them effective sources of threat and fed my anticipation of their comeuppance. Unfortunately, the heavy cutting and trimming have left only the bare bones of a film. Many plot points felt very rushed or unfinished. For instance, the clumsy intertwinement of Hans' inheritance reveal with the dialogue, which made the whole thing feel like an afterthought. The appearance of several characters felt more like an intrusion than an introduction, and some scenes were so disjointed and self-contained that we could rearrange them without even slightly affecting the plot. Although I like that the film went around showing the day-to-day lives of the sideshow performers, what I would have liked more is for these characters to be more involved in the plot, because as it stands, most of them remain isolated from the main conflict until the very end. The most relevant of these vignettes is the one where Angelino and his partner express their concerns about Cleopatra's intentions and foreshadow her fate if these concerns turn out to be accurate. This is an important, albeit short, scene that hints at the fact that the benign affability of these characters is conditional, and that there is retribution for pushing them beyond their limits. But it was not enough. The film needed more to build up to that ending. Sure, the cut content might have filled these gaps, but as a viewer, I only have this version to evaluate, and sadly, this version is fragmented. As for that edgy finale, generally speaking, I thought it was satisfying. Having these characters gather around Cleopatra while she was attempting to poison their friend, and watching them pull their weapons one after the other guaranteed a cold, unrelenting revenge. What I didn't like was mutilating Cleopatra and turning her into a duck. First of all, how can you turn a human being into a duck? What kind of surgery was performed? The whole thing is nonsensical. Secondly, mutilating a person and forcing a lifetime of suffering upon her clashes with the humane portrayal of these characters. It's not that she doesn't deserve it, I think both she and Hercules deserve the worst, but having our heroes go out of their way to do this gives the impression that their actions are spite-driven, not for the sake of justice. And this concept of revenge by turning the oppressor into the oppressed is, in my opinion, very shallow and immature, because instead of defending an identity, the identity here is being used as a form of punishment. This reminds me of a short movie called Skin, which won an Oscar back in 2019. The movie tackles racism, and it concludes by having a group of black men abduct a racist character, tattoo his entire skin until it turns black, and then release him back to his racist companions, who shoot him on sight because they think he's a black person. A very profound depiction of racism. Freaks ending isn't as ludicrous, but it's not that far off, and it left a sour taste in my mouth. Freaks deserves a great deal of appreciation and respect for daring to go against the tide and for representing a specific sector of the population during a time when society refused to acknowledge them as anything other than grotesque oddities. In addition to being a decent revenge story with some remarkable moments. But what was salvaged from decades of censorship does not fare very well as a cinematic experience. And in the end, I found myself more interested in the controversy surrounding Freaks than the film itself, and I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. What did you guys think of Freaks, and how do you feel when it comes to casting disabled roles? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the bell, and I'll see you next time.